Hey guys, I just want to clear a few things up. At the time of recording this, I'm not sure if my Oscar prediction video is going to go up before or after this video. Probably before, but they should be coming out around the same time. I am really swamped for work right now, between a few projects, and I don't think I'm going to do a live stream for a while. I was going back and forth with Horizon Zero Dawn live streams, and I think I've reached the point where, to be perfectly honest, like, I'm actually on some new medicine, and it's made me feel kind of mellow and slow, and I just want to take things easy for a while. But I can't. I got work to do. So, without further ado, here is my long time coming From Pixels to Pictures video on Hello everybody, and welcome to From Pixels to Pictures, where we take a look at film adaptations of video games and judge how well they did at adapting the source material, as well as how well they could have done. Today, we're in for a real knockout, pun fully intended, with Mortal Kombat. Released in 1992, the arcade game was a huge success. It had digitized actors, realistic backgrounds, fun controls, and enough violence and gore to give my mom a heart attack. Now, so far, Hollywood's film adaptations of video games had a pretty bad track record. Both Super Mario Bros. And Double Dragon flopped at the box office, but Street Fighter actually made a profit. So Hollywood started to think that maybe the route to go was fighting games, and they tried their hand at Mortal Kombat. The film adaptation of the game was released on August 18, 1995, starring Robin Shou, Lyndon Ashby, Bridget Wilson, Cary Tagawa, and Christopher Lambert. And here's a shocker. It opened number 1 at the box office, and it stayed at number 1 for 3 full weeks. The final box office tally was over $70 million, making it the 22nd highest-grossing film of 1995. Now that's what I call a success. Studio business heads were like, okay, we had a bit of a rocky start coming out of the gate, but now we know that video game movies can actually make money, so we're definitely going to keep doing them. This may or may not have been a mistake. As for the reviews of the film, it got a score of 34% on Rotten Tomatoes, which sounds bad until you realize that it's technically in the top 10 for best reviewed video game movies on the site. The movie also has its fair share of fans who enjoy the film unironically. So, top that off with the fact that I genuinely liked Street Fighter, and I was all set to love this movie. And that's not really what happened. Let's take a look at From Pixels to Pictures, Mortal Kombat. Round 1. Characters. Much like Street Fighter, there are a lot of characters, and the filmmakers had to include all of them in various roles. However, unlike Street Fighter, it wasn't very successful in this endeavor, and I feel like it's important to take it on a character-by-character basis. In the movie, there is some debate over which character is the protagonist. I've seen several different accounts of which actor received top billing. But for the sake of this video, I'm going to say that the protagonist of the film is Liu Kang. The film opens up with his dream sequence, and he's the one who fights the villain one-on-one at the end. And this is a character that almost works. I get why the filmmakers chose to focus on Liu Kang. He's the first character listed in the game instruction manual, and it was a pretty big deal at that time for a big-budget movie to have an Asian actor in the lead role. I also understand why they cast Robin Shou for the part. He looks like the character from the game, he's ethnically appropriate, he's good-looking, and he knows martial arts. There's just one tiny little problem. Robin Shou cannot act to save his life. I'm serious. This is the kind of performance that you would see in a middle school play. Anytime he's called on to do an emotional scene, which is unfortunately often, Robin Shou chooses to emote by giving a blank stare and blinking rapidly. And it doesn't feel like he's phoning it in. Instead, it feels like he wants to act, but he has no idea how. And seeing how Liu Kang is supposed to be the emotional center of the movie, that's a huge problem. Moving on to another character, Johnny Cage, played by Lyndon Ashby. This guy is something of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, Lyndon Ashby is the only actor in this movie who's actually putting in some effort. He looks the part, and I have no problem believing Johnny Cage's character and personality. The problem is, it's not a personality that you want to be around. Johnny Cage is a jerk, and that's putting it in family-friendly terms. I mean, this guy arrives in Asia for the tournament, and literally the very first Asian person he sees, he's like, "Oh, you must be the bellboy."
Everyone's a little bit racist.
I get what they're trying to do. They want him to be the likable jerk, like Bill Murray in Groundhog Day or Kristen Bell in The Good Place, but it can be really hard to pull that kind of role off. And in all fairness, maybe he would have worked better if he had better actors to work off of. There's a saying in acting that goes like this: you're only as good as your scene partners. And this cast did not do a good job of helping each other out. And then we have Sonya, and I have a real axe to grind with this character. Once again, she looks the part, and her performance is perfectly serviceable. While I was doing research, I found out that Cameron Diaz was the original choice to play the part, but she broke her wrist before filming started and had to be replaced at the last minute. I am a little curious to see what she would have brought to the role, but it certainly wouldn't have saved the film. No, what really bothers me is the way this character is written. For the first 2/3 of the movie, Sonya is a true force to be reckoned with. She's an FBI agent who always has her eyes on the prize, and she wins multiple fights through sheer merit. She kicks butt and looks good doing it. And then comes the third act of the movie, where out of nowhere, suddenly all her badass qualities disappear and she becomes a screaming damsel in distress. She's an FBI agent, but she gets kidnapped, off screen mind you, and all she does is scream for the men to save her. And even after she's been saved during the climax, she doesn't fight alongside her friends. And what makes it even more insulting is the lesson she's supposed to learn. I'll talk about this more in the story route, but Raiden gives the three main characters a lesson to learn, and Sonya's is apparently learn when to ask for help. Which is actually an important lesson in life, but in this scenario, what exactly is this movie telling young girls? Now, I know you want to be like Sonya when you grow up, but you see, all that fighting wasn't what she should have been doing. In the end, she learns her lesson to sit back and contribute absolutely nothing while the men do all the real work. Ugh. I mean, I guess it was a different time, but I don't care. A bad moral is a bad moral. Moving on to Raiden. I'm sorry, but this guy is too much. He looks way too young to be playing the part of the wise mentor, and that voice... That is a stupid, stupid voice. I could never take anything he said seriously, which is a real problem. But again, at least he sort of looks like his game counterpart. One character who definitely does not look like his game counterpart is Shang Tsung. In the game, he's almost like the Emperor from Star Wars, sitting in the background, judging everything you do. You feel his presence, and you almost get the sense that he could snap his fingers and you're dead. And when you do eventually fight him, he uses his shape-shifting ability to morph into every foe that you've fought up until this point. Not the most complicated villain in the world, but much better than what we got in the movie. Much like some of the other villains we've looked at on this show, this guy is just evil for the sake of being evil. No depth. And honestly, this actor isn't even having that much fun in the role. Everything's just on autopilot. So we don't care about this villain, and we certainly don't fear him. As for the rest of the characters, surprisingly there's not much to say. They're all just one-dimensional villains for the sake of being one-dimensional villains. But I'll give them this. They look remarkably similar to their video game counterparts, and that is commendable. I do want to single out Goro, though. In the video game, Goro is one of those bosses I spent hours on. It took a lot of trial and error for me to find the right strategies to use against him, and even more trial and error to actually use those strategies effectively. The movie builds up Goro big time, showing him killing many, many opponents who dare stand in his way. So when Johnny Cage finally goes up against Goro, the unstoppable fighter, I'm legitimately curious and ready for a kick-ass action scene. So, how does Johnny Cage defeat Goro? A 90s cross shot. Yes, really. And yeah, there is a very short rematch that follows this scene, but it's nowhere near the awesome fight I was expecting, and it just seems hugely disrespectful to the character. Bottom line, the fact that the characters all look like their game counterparts and that the cast is full of ethnically appropriate actors is ultimately going to save it from getting too low of a score. but overall the depiction of the characters in this game is just poor. I'm giving it a 4. Our next round is setting, and I'm actually going to be a little bit more forgiving to the movie in this round. As I said before, even though the movie has issues with characterization, the majority of the characters do look like their game counterparts, and this movie, in general, seems to get the look of the games down really well. Let's start with what I think is one of the film's best assets, the cinematography. Director of photography John R. Leonetti does his best to frame the characters and sets in a visually appealing way. It might not be Oscar-worthy, but in an otherwise subpar film, this cinematography definitely stands out. But moving on to the actual sets. I have to give major props to the filmmakers here, because at some point in the development stage of this film, somebody said, "Here's a crazy idea, what if we make it look like the game?" And that's exactly what they did. The 16-bit visuals from the game are recreated down to the pixel for this movie. Each individual level is brought to life in some way, including both indoor and outdoor locations, and it feels faithful to the world of the game established. It actually kind of feels like you've stepped inside the game, which is exactly how a film adaptation of a video game should feel. So finally, this movie gets it. There is, however, one tiny downside. Even though the visuals look like the game, they don't look very realistic. In fact, many of the sets look like they came right out of a Mortal Kombat theme park. And on top of that, the visual effects did not age well at all. Goro is the only effect that still somewhat holds up. The rest of the CG looks like something from a CDI game. I don't know how these effects look in 1995, but today it looks bad. But there is something to be said for actually getting the look of the game down. Even many of the characters are spot on. So for that, I'm going to give the film an 8. Our third round looks at story. In a nutshell, the plot of the film follows the plot of the game, or at least what little plot the game has. Really, at a certain point, we stop comparing the movie to the game and start comparing it to the game's instruction manual. Because in the manual, they explain the whole story. There is an ancient martial arts tournament. Ever since Shang Tsung took over, the tournament has lost its honor. Liu Kang, Johnny Cage, and Sonya each have their own personal reasons for fighting in the tournament, and all of these characters are prepared to fight to the death. Story-wise, it all matches up. But it does beg the question, is the story they're telling a good one? Well, let's start with Raiden's role. It was significantly changed for the movie so that he can be the wise old mentor figure, even though Christopher Lambert is clearly too young for the role. He talks about how the three main characters need to grow as people. Johnny Cage has to learn to be less of a jerk, Liu Kang has to learn to let go of the guilt he feels over his brother's death, and Sonya, well, we've already said enough about her arc. Now, the idea of the mentor helping the protagonist become better people, as cliché as it might be, it could have actually worked. However, Raiden keeps insisting that these lessons will not only help the protagonists become better people, but also help them become better fighters. But there is a key problem here. Throughout the film, we see no evidence that any of these characters need to become better fighters, because they win every single fight. Of the three protagonists, we never see any of them lose in fighting. Ever. And some of you might say, well, that's because it's Mortal Kombat. Losing means death. But if you've studied storytelling at all, you know that if you're going to write an interesting story, the conflict doesn't feel real unless the protagonist loses somewhere. There has to be a setback. Something that makes the protagonist, or protagonists in this case, realize that they are flawed. That they're not ready to face the primary antagonist just yet. But not in this movie. Raiden says that the characters need to improve as people if they want to stand any chance against Shang Tsung, but all three protagonists seem to have no problem kicking butt in the martial arts arena. We can see what their character flaws are, but we can't see how that carries over to their fighting. And then later on in the movie, after they win a few more fights, Raiden is like, "See, you're learning." No, they're not. They're doing the exact same thing that they were doing before. The one other thing I want to talk about is Liu Kang's arc. The movie opens with him having a nightmare about his brother's death. Then we see him have a decently written scene with his sensei about his quest for vengeance. Honestly, if the acting were a little better, I might have been a lot more invested in this. But then we get to the finale. By this point, we've already seen that Shang Tsung can shapeshift like his game counterpart, because he did it once in the beginning. So, for the climax, he turns into Liu Kang's brother and makes a plea. We see that Liu Kang wants to believe that his brother is back, but he knows deep down that it isn't true, and in this scene he is finally able to let go of the past. This scene could have been genuinely emotional if it weren't for two little details. One, Robin Shou's acting, or lack thereof. And two, Shang Tsung transforms into Liu Kang's brother right in front of him. Seriously, all they needed to do was have him walk through a door and have him emerge as the brother. That would have been fine. But instead, while Liu Kang is having this internal struggle of whether or not his brother has truly come back from the dead, all I'm thinking is, you just saw him transform a second ago. Are you that dense? And then, when Shang Tsung changes back, Liu Kang actually looks surprised. What, do you have short-term memory or something? It makes no sense. So, when it all comes down to it, the story in this movie just doesn't work as much as you'd want it to. They tried to make it a character-based story, but I never believed that these three characters were growing as a team. And honestly, that feels like it's mostly a problem with the acting. These actors have zero chemistry, and I admire that they tried to make the story like the game, but the end result just doesn't work as an adaptation or as a finished film. I give it a 3. And now the final category, experience. In many ways, the original Mortal Kombat game was a lot like Street Fighter 2. They're both fighting games with a wide selection of playable characters who all have their own backstory. But there are a couple of prominent differences between the two games. For one thing, the game uses digitized actors to play the characters, so they look more like real people and they sound like real people too. In fact, there are actually actors credited at the end for playing these characters. And the funny thing is, I think they may have turned in better performances than the movie actors. Okay, all joking aside, there is one other aspect that sets Mortal Kombat apart from other fighting games of the time: the excessive amount of violence and gore. In many ways, this game was exploitative when it first came out. It didn't hold anything back. It was the most bloody thing you could play in the arcades, and kids loved it, even if their parents weren't so happy. Now, when it came to adapting this game into a movie, the filmmakers had an obvious dilemma on their hands. The game is incredibly bloody and violent, but it also has a very young audience, and in translating the source material into a film, you would have to give it an R rating in order to properly convey the excessive gore that is so iconic from the games. But in doing so, you would alienate the target audience of kids and teenagers that you're trying to get to see this movie. It was pretty much a lose-lose scenario. So naturally, the filmmakers went with a solution that would make them more money and gave the movie a PG-13 rating, cutting out all the gore in the process. Now, I have mixed feelings on this. The gore is an iconic element from the game, and keeping it would have made for a more faithful adaptation. But with that being said, I totally understand why the filmmakers made the decision that they did. And it's worth pointing out that in the SNES port of the game, which is the one I played for research purposes, the gore was removed. So you could argue that this film is truly an adaptation of the SNES version. Can this property work without its trademark gore? In my opinion, yes. It's not as memorable to be sure, but the SNES version is still a fun fighting game. And as for the movie, well, I will say this. While we didn't really get any gore, the film does show us that anyone who loses the tournament has their soul taken by Shang Tsung, and the whole process looks pretty disturbing. So, I feel that was a good compromise. The action sequences are good in their own right, and I like how each character seemed to have their own way of fighting, which was one of the main themes of the game. And one thing that I definitely have to give a shout out to is the music. Normally I have a problem with film adaptations of games not using any of the music from the game, but in this case, I can't get too upset about it. This main theme is truly a phenomenal piece of music, and it's a lot more memorable than any of the game's score. Ultimately, when I look at the whole experience aspect of the story, I don't have that many complaints. I feel that they did a pretty good job. So I think I'm going to give it a 7. So, when all's added up, Mortal Kombat gets 22 out of 40, 55%, for a final score of F. I will say, this film came genuinely close to a D-, and it's definitely a better film than either Super Mario Bros. Or Double Dragon. I got a sense that the filmmakers were trying, and the visuals actually do look like the game. They just needed a better sense of characterization and storytelling. They came oh so close to a passing grade, but they just couldn't make it in the end. But what do you guys think? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and join me next time when I take a look at the film's sequel and one of the most hated video game adaptations out there, Mortal Kombat Annihilation. Pray for me.